Okay, so yeah, welcome back to another section of the core module of the Equip to Proclaim series. So in the last two sections, we looked at the Kalam cosmological argument. So we covered that how it is an argument that brings in points from philosophy and points from science. It is a great way to present a robust case for a creator behind the universe. And because it brings in points from science and philosophy, one of the points that I mentioned in the last session is that if you're talking to a person who doesn't understand the dynamics of infinite and potentially actually infinite and potentially infinite, or someone who doesn't want to get lost in the weeds between tensed theory of time and tenseless theory of time, all that complex stuff, pointing out scientific data on the Big Bang theory pointing towards the beginning of the universe makes it much easier to put across. And the first premise, everything that begins exists as a cause, is something that you can easily correspond and connect with the person's common understanding of reality. So that is one of the key advantages with the Kalam, that it has the strength of philosophy and scientific arguments. With the moral argument, one thing we see that this is an argument that has a lot of personal persuasion. This is an argument that people come in by already accepting premise two. So, in fact, I remember once Dr. Craig mentioning to a UK audience saying that this is an argument that he has seen college students find most resonating with because of the moral emphasis of the argument. And this is also an argument where you will see people who are convicted or who are convinced that they don't want a God. This is a place where you will see people holding on to very extreme position that they won't put up with their personal life. So I've seen this happen in our engagement with, we have a sort of like a class reunion sort of group, and me and one of my friends, he likes apologetics, is very interested in stuff. So he's from a mathematics background, so he listens to Frank Turek and all of that. And there is a classmate among the others. There's one of the classmates who is a very vocal atheist. So when we would get into discussion on God and all that stuff, at one point he very clearly said, I cannot live my life under the precepts of atheism. I cannot live a consistent life. I talk to you guys about morality being subjective and all that stuff, but to live in society, I have to live as if atheism is wrong. So in our correspondence, in our dialogue, when we were talking about moral argument and stuff, he took a position as if that the moral argument was completely unsound. But when he came to the point of a way of living out his life, he very honestly, and I appreciate him for his honesty, that he very honestly said that I have to be dishonest in the way I live my life. So this is one of the ways that the moral argument will uncover that. So with regards to what we'll be covering, we'll look at what the moral argument is, then what moral values will do under the atheistic framework, what does moral duties do under the atheistic framework, and then we'll ask the question, can atheists be moral? So this will tie into some of the objections that may come up, some of the misunderstandings of the moral argument. So we're sort of preemptively preparing for all of this. So the moral argument basically does is that it argues towards a being, that there is this one particular being that exists, and it argues that this being is the embodiment, the very source of ultimate good and the source of objective morality. So this is that all that the argument does. Just like the Kalam, the argument doesn't say that this is the God of Christianity, this is the tri-personal God of the Bible, or anything of that sort. It just points towards a being. Now, in the Kalam, we saw that this points towards a cause behind the universe, and then with the conceptual analysis of the conclusion of the argument, we saw that this cause of the universe cannot be a power or an abstract entity like numbers, but it has to be a personal being. So that was not what the Kalam said, it is what we understood from the analysis of the conclusion. With the moral argument, we are arguing towards a personal being in the beginning itself, because there is no way you can get to it and try to ground it in some sort of non-personal entity. So this is again, this is not arguing for the God of the Bible, but arguing for a being that we immediately understand resonates very much with what Christian theology tells about the God of the Bible. So this is the framework of the moral argument, very similar to the Kalam. Premise one says, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Then we say that objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. This argument gets us into an interesting way on how these premises are formulated. So anyway, I don't want to get into that, because this is a very unique formulation of the premise conclusion format. This is distinct from the Kalam, and most often you will see people making mistake in formatting the style of the premise, because they misunderstand how the moral argument is formulated. But then again, that doesn't really concern us too much. So, getting into the moral argument, there are a couple of terms that we have to understand with. So, first immediately would be objective versus subjective. How do you explain to a person what is the difference between objective and subjective? Well, objective, as the name sounds, is dependent on the object. Subjective is, on the other hand, dependent on the subject. So, let's use an example of ice cream. um, Ice cream taste versus calories. Now, the taste part is a subjective aspect, right? For me, I prefer vanilla ice cream, and I tried out what was it? Tiramisu the other day when Jovim Bro took us for dinner. I thought it would be good, but it wasn't. So, taste part is something that changes with the person. We all understand it to be. Stephen takes more salt than me when we make meal. I take little less salt, so it changes. But at the same time, that ice cream or that meal has an objective part, the calorie amount. That doesn't depend or differ from person to person. So this ice cream example would be a very easy way for us to point out to a person what is the difference between objective and subjective. Taste is subjective, depends on the subject, but the calorie that a cup of ice cream has, or the sugar content that a cup of ice cream has, is objective. It doesn't depend whether I like that ice cream or not. And what we see with this nature of when we say something is objective is that because it is not dependent on me, the subject, it is not dependent on the culture as well. Because the culture is an amalgamation or a summation of individuals. Culture is what the individuals bring together. So the moment we say that something is objective, meaning that it is beyond human taste and preference and stuff, it inevitably supersedes cultural expectations, cultural ideas as such. Because the culture is what people's perception, ideas, and likeness are all put together with. So this is the key thing to remember, because when we get into talking about how do we make sense of morality, this distinction of it transcending culture will come into play. So objective or subjective is pretty clear. Okay, absolute versus relative. This is a point that we don't talk about when we're talking about the moral argument, but it benefits us from understanding it. Absolute would be saying irrespective of a situation. Relative is saying respective of the situation. So, like you see the example, right? Aborting a baby versus killing a terrorist. Now, we can easily point out how aborting a baby is something that is clearly wrong, right? Because it is respective to the situation. But killing a terrorist, we won't necessarily argue that it is as wrong as aborting a baby is, because the situation is different. So in both instances, a human life is lost, but it is a relative action that is happening because it is dependent on the situation. So when I first learned about moral argument and stuff, all I kept on hearing was objective or subjective, and I would hear that relativism is contra Christianity. So when I came across absolute versus relative, my immediate thought was to think that, oh, I have to go for absolute. But the way we see morality play out is it's relative in this instance, not relative as it depends from person to person, but it depends from situation to situation. And so this would get into interesting points like divine command theory on how God reveals morality and all of that stuff. So it's a very interesting point to explore in a depth maybe sometime later. But absolute versus relative, when we're talking about morality, this is what it means. It is dependent and connected with the situation. On the other hand, with objective, it had to do with the object or the subject. Now, the third key point, right? Values versus duties. This is a very fine distinction because we use the word good, bad, right, and wrong interchangeably in our colloquial usage. But in a core philosophy sense, when we say values, it has to do with the inherent worth of an action or an intent, good or bad. And right and duties has to do with the obligatoriness of that action, right or wrong. So that's an example. It is good to be an economist, right? There's nothing inherently bad with being an economist. So being an economist is a good idea. You're contributing towards the field, it's a the rigorous field, and so on and so forth. But we cannot say it is a duty of a person to be an economist. That obligatoriness we cannot bring forth in that sense. So while it is not bad for me to not be a firefighter, we can't say that it is wrong for me if I choose not to be a firefighter. That wrong right usage cannot be brought in. So this good, bad, right, and wrong is actually usages that connect with the values of what it is inherently worth. Right, wrong tell about the duty aspect of it. So when we get into the subsequent part, we will see how this is a very key distinction. How this plays very quite keyly into understanding what is the source of morality. Because thing is, we all understand that there are moral actions that are both bad and wrong at the same time. So a way to ground moral right and wrong, a way to ground moral bad and good has to take into account both the worth of the action and the obligatoriness of the action. So to distinguish between this values and duties, right? To distinguish between value and duty, here's a very good example. So this is known as Sophie's choice, and this draws off from a novel. And so Sophie's choice is that Sophie is a woman who is in the Auschwitz concentration camp, and she is being presented with an option, right? An impossible choice, which is that she has two kids. They are forcing her to pick one kid to live while the other kid will be gassed to death. So either she chooses one kid and has one kid survive, or she restrains from choosing and ends up losing both of the kids and has to live with the guilt. So here in this instance, okay, this very painstaking evil instance, if Sophie chooses to pick one child, right, she isn't doing anything inherently wrong or as such. Even though the choice is not a good choice, right? She's subsequently or indirectly caused the death of a child, but the choice isn't the wrong thing. She isn't morally obligated to not choose to save one child. So this is an instance to, and again, I'm bringing all these examples. I know our crowd right now with Divichan and Subrech, there our crowd is more tuned towards the philosophy part. The reason I'm bringing these examples is that it pays to help identify to a layperson audience what we mean by good, bad, right, and wrong. And this distinction is very key because I've seen so many instances people try to ground morality without having the duty aspect connected to it. So they would say something about how evolution grounds morality and stuff, but the duty aspect is completely missing out because they don't know the difference between good and right and bad and wrong. But what we are trying to do is we want our audience to be primed up with the core and the well primed up aspect of the argument so that you're better prepared. So again, Sophie's choice is a way to indicate the difference between good, bad, and right and wrong. Sophie's choice is bad, but like I said, the bad isn't wrong always. Sophie's choice is a bad choice. It isn't a good choice to pick one child while the other dies. But it isn't a wrong choice. She isn't committing any moral crime by taking this inherently bad choice. So taking this into context, we're going to see what we mean by objective moral values and objective moral duties. What we have looked at objective versus subjective, we have looked at values versus duties. So what does it mean to say we have objective moral values? It means that we have value systems or values which point towards the inherent worth of an action, at the very least, that is not dependent on me as a person. My opinion, my taste, my preference are irrelevant. If I say something is inherently objectively bad, then the worth of that action is bad, irrespective of my taste, preference, and stuff. When I say objective moral duties and I say that action is wrong, then the fact that I am obligated to not do that action is irrespective of my taste, preference, likeness, affinity towards that action. So now we have seen the core element of the argument. We have seen what objective is, and we have seen what values and duties is. So I hope so far this made sense and it was easy to follow along. So to understand, to come to terms with the objectivity of morality, right? This next quote brings it to light so clearly. It took me, when I first read it, it took me by shock. So the quote is, when we say that the Holocaust is objectively wrong, it means that it was wrong, even though the Nazis thought that it was right. And it would still have been wrong, even if the Nazis had succeeded in exterminating or brainwashing everybody who disagreed with them, so that it was universally believed that the Holocaust was right. So what Dr. Craig is saying that to say that the Holocaust is objectively wrong means that even if every single person on the planet vocally, unequivocally, unanimously says it is right, it would still be objectively wrong. Because that is what we mean by objectively wrong. When we first get into it, we think that it is because we all agree that it's wrong, but it's because of an innate understanding of it being wrong. So the opinions of the people are irrelevant, because if it was dependent on the opinion, then it would be subjective. And it was dependent on the opinion of the mass, then right and wrong won't be beyond cultures. It would be subservient to cultures, because the opinion of the mass is what forms the cultures as well. So then you can't say things like slavery was objectively wrong, because it was a cultural system that set up a structure, a moral structure that told that slavery was right. So you can't get it beyond structures as well. So this sort of brings to highlight what we actually mean by objective morality, that irrespective of the unanimous opinions of people, it would still be wrong. Now we're going to look and see how moral values would fit under understanding of atheism. How can we make a workout or try to understand within atheism? So here are some of the consequence if atheism is true, right? If theism is false, then there is no force order behind it. We are here by chance, and the only option that we have to explain our existence or our arrival here is by evolution. And so then what that would mean is that everything that we do is survival driven. That includes our values, that which we believe to be true. Everything becomes survival driven. So that is clear. So this is what we're going to look at if atheism is true, right? And then we have this famous quote by Richard Dawkins. No design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but indifference. And then he says, it is every living object's sole reason for being. What is the sole reason for being? Just to propagate DNA. That is it. That is our mission. That is our purpose. We can't even use the word purpose, but then again, that is what we are moving towards. Every living species, every living object. So this is the concept that we have under atheism, and we are trying to see, okay, in response to the moral argument, can you try and have moral values under atheism? That's what we're going to try and explore, and what atheist philosophers themselves think about it. So Michael Roos, then looking at what morality would mean under atheism, he comes up and says, ethics is illusory. And here by ethics, we are using it to mean equal with morality as well. He says ethics is illusionary. When you say something like love your neighbor, you think you are referring to something above and beyond yourself. But morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. So this atheist philosopher is coming up very clearly and saying it is just a delusion, right? Like the God delusion, this is the atheism delusion. When you hold on to atheism, you are left to a system where there is nothing above and beyond you. Like he says, there's nothing above and beyond ourselves. And everything that we do, as Dawkins said, is just to propagate the DNA. So that is the metric to decide, to even if you want to decide, that is the metric to decide whether we should do or not do. And so when Dawkins says something like machines propagating DNA, right, if that is the sole intent of human progression, then you have to ponder what it means for evils like rape. Right? Within Dawkins' very brute definition, such actions cannot be termed moral or immoral. Again, Dawkins says no evil, no good. So that goes out the window. So those actions are morally neutral. There is no moral application to those actions, and they just serve the purpose of survival. So this is what we're seeing starting to build up under atheism. You do not have any inherent worth to actions. Like he said, no evil, no purpose, and as Bruce said. So we are seeing from a very lay person, public person's perspective of Dawkins to a highly academic, respected atheist philosopher like Michael Rose, both pointing out that there is nothing really wrong or good out there. There's nothing really bad or good out there. Just illusion, just what we think could be the case. So then in that case, what next follows is that nothing makes us morally superior to animals, because what happens is that if you rewind the reel of evolution, because it is here by pure chance, right, you're going to end up with a completely different species with completely different ideas of surviving. And obviously that means there's nothing objective about it, right? Because if you rewind the reel, you may get with a different form of species that thinks differently about right and wrong or good and bad. So it again changes from the subject to subject. This subject thinks in this way, that possible subject thinks in that way. We could bring to effect for a person who may not understand the rewind in the real life evolution, we can point towards winning a lottery. There is nothing destined about a lottery. You go through the lottery process again, a different random number comes up. So there is nothing specific that has to do with the object here. So in this case, we see that when you take up atheism, because it rules out any purpose or agent or cause behind human existence, it rules out any other creation mechanism. The only creation mechanism you have is evolution, pure chance. Pure chance that is randomly bringing about this particular species. This particular species that is driven by the need for survival. As this particular species that has no real understanding of moral worth or duties as such. So then you lose the complete grounding for objectivity immediately off the bat because of the evolutionary mechanism that is brought in by atheism. So we've seen that we can't argue for moral worth or moral values under atheism. There is no grounding for it. What about moral duties under atheism? So the moment you see that you find it hard to ground moral values, duties instantly becomes even more difficult to ground. And this is why I said why I emphasize so much on making the difference between values and worth, values and duties. So like I said before, a lot of time people would engage into these conversations thinking they can ground values some way, but then they forget the fact that they have no way to ground duties as such. And that's this becomes most difficult under atheism because it implies obligations. And we can think about instance where a human murders but an animal kills. That points towards the obligatory side of it, the right and wrong side of it. Why is it that we say that a human murders but an animal kills? What is the distinction between our species in that sense that we don't use the terminologies to mean that? The moral obligatoriness is restricted to human species but not to animals. Now, this can veer off into very different arguments about human mind and as such for God, but we are not going to get into that. And so, ethicists, again, an atheist ethicist, Richard Taylor points out this fact saying that, the hawk does this, the hawk sees us, it doesn't steal, it takes it but it doesn't steal, it kills it but doesn't murder, and says, for none of these things is forbidden. And as we said, look right before, we are also the equal product of evolution. It's just that we veered off differently. We are also equal animals in the system. So why is it that the animal world has no moral obligatoriness? Right? When we say murder and kill, it implies an obligatoriness to it as well. So why is it that we do not restrain a hawk from seizing the fish? Why is it not wrong for the hawk to seize the fish? Why is it not stealing but just seizing? Why is it not stealing but just taking? All of this connect to the point of the duty system in there. And so we come to the part that if there is no system behind humans, then who imposes and demands accountability? Because that is what right and wrong and obligatoriness means. So this example that I use is a pamphlet informing curfew. That you walk out, you see a pamphlet given to you, and it says there's curfew from 8 p.m. tonight. So you're given two pamphlets. One pamphlet says curfew from 8 p.m. Another pamphlet says curfew from tomorrow 8 p.m. The second one has a seal of the government. The first one doesn't have a seal. Our immediate inclination is to lean towards the second pamphlet because there is a role of authority behind it. There is a personal or an agency behind it instituting that curfew. So our immediate understanding of that would be is the second one is more valid than the first one. That is the same thing that we find here. Even if you have values, even if you have a pamphlet saying you shouldn't step out after 8 p.m. today or tomorrow, because there is no sort of agency or source instituting and demanding accountability, you ask the question, why should I listen to this pamphlet? Like, why should I give heed to this pamphlet? Because if that was the case, I could go out and hand out pamphlets on anything and everything, and I should expect people to abide by it. Right? The legitimate agency behind the government, the legitimate agency behind the pamphlet is what institutes obligatoryness, is what institutes obedience to those mechanisms, to those institutions right there. So if you don't have the system of obligatoriness, then what happens? That things like rape and incest, it may be taboo, it may be undesirable, but not wrong. Because who is to say what is right and what is wrong? Who is to institute the duty aspect of these actions? Who is to say that I should not do it? Right? Someone can say it's bad to do, but my question would be, why should I listen to you? That is my immediate response. Why should I listen to what you are going to say? So if there is no system or mechanism or agency that is instituting this obligatoriness, that is demanding that we should stick by it, why should I stick by it? Because we often see that when we are altruistic, when we keep aside our selfishness, we do things that are suboptimal to us. So even in economics, when we are studying about behavioral economics and ethics and economics in this semester, we're talking about these points of human beings acting suboptimally, human beings acting with sub-self-interest efficiency. They're doing things that doesn't actually serve to our self-interest. So in the same instance, why should I keep aside my self-interest? Who is to say that I should keep aside my self-interest? So under atheism, we have already seen the objective values part deteriorating, nothing to ground it. And obviously, it's even more difficult to ground any sort of right and wrong, any sort of obligation on persons, because there is even less grounding. And so Richard Taylor comes up very clearly says that the concept of moral obligation is unintelligible. You can't make sense of it apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but their meaning is gone. This is the most clear statement by an atheist philosopher on how you cannot have obligation if there is no one beyond the human system. If there is no one distinct from humans to direct and command actions, or to direct and command actions to not be done. So we've seen how moral values and duties cannot function within the construct of atheism, why it's very difficult to build up. So we've just looked at a very brief overview of it, but the principles that we have covered are the points that we can keep coming back to. The points and the essence that we've covered are things that we can keep coming back to, even if you were in an impromptu discussion with an atheist. Again, keep in mind, we are arguing for objective moral values and duties. They may try to get off the hook by arguing for just a value system, but the duties aspect is very much a part of it. Why should I do it? Why should I obey? Why should I listen aspect? The next thing is, can atheists be moral? This is a question that is often asked. Okay, are you saying that only people who believe in God can be moral? Well, obviously not. This is a deviation from what we're trying to say here. We're not talking about belief in God. We're talking about God. We're not saying that for us to have objective morality, you need to have a belief in God. What we are actually saying is you need to have God for there to be objective morality, objective moral values and duties. And we're not talking about referencing God. You can still not reference God and still live a moral life, because does there exist okay, I will use a physical philosophical term, a metaphysical grounding for morality? Does there exist an immaterial grounding for morality that is again independent of me as a person, right? I mean, if only theists can be moral, meaning only people who believe in God can have morality, then that doesn't look objective to me. That sort of looks subjective to me, because my moral application and my moral connection is then immediately depend on me as a person, whether I believe God exists or not. That doesn't line up with what we are arguing in the first place, objective morality. So we are talking about belief, not belief in God, but that God Himself. If God does not exist, irrespective of whether I believe He does or He doesn't, or whether I think He is pantheistic or panentheistic or polytheistic or whatever it is, if that grounding source is not there, irrespective of my inclination towards the grounding source, we cannot have objective morality there. And which way philosophers point out that a non-theist need not be an atheist. A non-theist can formulate ethical system and recognize objective moral values without reference to God. So again, we're not talking about whether someone referenced God in setting up those moral systems. And this is the distinction where we say with moral epistemology and moral ontology. Moral epistemology is asking, how do I know what I know about morality? Moral ontology asks the question, what is morality? What is its nature? What is its source? We're talking about the very existence of morality. Moral epistemology would concern the question of, how do I know what I know about morality? Now, you may know it from your grandparents, you may know it from your parents, you may know it from society. All of that is irrelevant. All of that is completely irrelevant. Because what we are arguing for is that you need to have morality grounded in a source beyond humans. If morality is to be really objective, if moral values and duties have to be objective, right? Which is why I said this argument is not talking about God. So if a person brings up about the Bible and slavery in the Bible and this in the Bible and that in the Bible, completely irrelevant. We are not saying that you can have morality only if you read the Bible. We are saying that there must be a personal being beyond humans existing who dictates right and wrong, who is a source of right and wrong for morality to exist. You can call it being God, you can call it being a supercomputer, you can call it whatever you want. You can call it being Allah as well. The argument would still stand. So make sure that you're keeping your eyes peeled for these red herrings that try to take up the discussion. Now, how can we say that non-theist, right, people who don't believe in as Christians, how can we say that people who are not Christians can formulate ethical systems and recognize objective morality without God? We see the answers in Romans 2, 14, 15, saying that Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciousness also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them and at other times even defending them. So this is a clear statement from scripture saying that we inherently know what is right and wrong, that it is sort of like written in our conscience, written in our hearts on how to distinguish between right and wrong. It gets muddled, it gets defaced, it gets disfigured by our nature of sin, but that doesn't in any way make us non-answerable to an accountability of right and wrong. Every human being has a sense of right and wrong ingrained in their hearts because we inherently have that image of God within us. That we have that personal mindset, that personal mind within us that is able to grasp these abstract realities as such. So this is the reason why an atheist can be moral. An atheist is able to make sense of what is right and wrong. He may disagree what is the grounding. He may be contradicting himself. He may be hypocritical of his standing. He may be taking a completely inconsistent stand, like my friend, the atheist friend who said, but he can still make sense and understand what is right and wrong. Now, the final part is, okay, if an atheist wants to somehow combine ground morality, right, objective moral values and duties, where can he do it? So the best sort of explanation that is put forward is atheistic moral Platonism, right? Now, Platonism is what Plato put forward. He's talking about abstract non-physical entities. So numbers is an example. These are abstract in that they don't cause anything, but they are non-physical as well, right? We don't see the number 2 under a rock. We don't see the number 5 hanging from a tree or anything of that sort. These are non-physical stuff. but they just exist. Now, this field of mathematics philosophy is very vigorous on how whether numbers really exist and stuff. You have people like George Rasmus, who's a Christian philosopher, who weirdly, even Dr. Craig mentioned that it's pretty weird, that he ascribes to Platonism when it comes to these abstract entities. So what atheistic moral Platonism tries to argue is that it is combined in this what Plato did, this existence of abstract objects, that they really exist. What they do, in fact, is they say that moral values actually exist, but they exist in this abstract sense, in this Platonic state. So do they exist? Yeah, they really exist. Like they say numbers really exist. So like a realistic approach to numbers as well. But they say they exist in this abstract form so that we can know and figure out stuff. But then the immediate question that comes forward is that, so what does it mean for justice, love, kindness, all of these things to exist abstractly, right? What does it mean to say that even if there are no humans, that love still exists? Like in the atheistic view, there is no God, so there is no personal being whatsoever. Because then you get to ask questions like, is love just? Right? Is love full of justice? Right? When you say, I am just, I'm a person who lives in accordance with justice. So we ask questions like, okay, is love just? What does that mean to even ask that? You can ask, am I loving? Am I a just person? Am I a kind person? But how do you ask, is love just? Because those seem to be properties that you can only ascribe to persons. Those seem to be things that can only make sense with a person involved. But if you say that these things like love and justice just exist, first of all, what does that mean if there is no humans? Second, can we ask these things interrelatively with them? These seem to make these applications, these sort of adjective usages of ethical values, moral values, seem to make only sense when applying to a person, when there is action involved. So how do you know I'm loving or I'm just? Well, my actions describe that. But if love, justice, kindness, goodness are all abstract, then there is no actions involved. They are by definition abstract. They don't bring about anything, they don't do anything, they don't cause anything. They are in every sense neutral in their existence. So it gets into a very weird form of trying to figure out what exactly the point is. Now, when we come to 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4 to 8, right, we see the description of love is patient, love is kind, does not envy, all of that. This makes sense to us because love is described in relation to who God is. Scripture says God is love, which way it makes sense for us to look at this passage and not be bewildered when we see what we saw just before, right? Because here in the Christian theology, love isn't existing as an abstract sense. It is rooted in God's nature, and He is a tri-personal being who does actions. So it makes perfect sense for a Christian to look at 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4 to 8, but it makes no sense for someone on atheistic moral Platonism to say stuff like love and justice just exist. Now, remember when I said before that it is difficult to ground moral values under atheism? It is even more difficult to ground objective duties under atheism. Because when we come to the final part, you cannot ground duties in any way under Platonism. Because who is to say that I should live my life by choosing this abstract entity love and not hate? Who is to say that? Why should I pick this and not the other? Is it wrong for me to pick hate? Is it right for me to pick love? Again, no grounding, no objective enforcement force or agency behind it. These are things that just exist out there. Like, I can live my entire life without referencing the number 1 trillion, 1 billion, right? And still I haven't committed any crime. They just exist abstractly. They have no particular relevance to my life. Are these ethical entities like love and justice, are they equivalent to numbers in that we could live a life completely neutral to them? There is no sense of enforcement that I have to reference them in my daily life. Where do you ground the enforceability, the obligatoriness, the right and wrong, the duties part of it? There is no explanation. And becomes even more interesting when the fact that these abstract values just exist, right? They just exist in the universe. They have no relation to us humans. So they exist for some weird reason as they are, not designed, not purpose, not put in place. They just exist. And then you have humans who have, by sheer chance, evolved to be creatures who can make sense and grasp of these abstract values. How is it that we can make sense of these abstract values? Were we created? No, we weren't created. We are here by pure evolution because we're talking about atheistic moral Platonism. So we are here by pure chance, and it so coincidentally happened that evolution brought for this particular species that could grasp, understand, and relate to these abstract entities that actually exist in nature, that exist in the universe. That's what Platonism says. They exist out there in this abstract form. So then atheistic moral Platonism has a problem of improbability as well. This high mathematical improbability of being here by chance to make sense of abstract entities. So atheistic moral Platonism becomes even more indefensible. Now, there is actually another difference also that goes into trying to ground morality, which goes into the brute facts point of it. But again, it gets very philosophical because trying to explain brute facts itself will take half an hour. And then those sort of things aren't things that immediately pop up in our discussion. Now, you will not see someone come up and say atheistic moral Platonism. I can guarantee you, in your discussion with the lay person, with a normal person, you will not see them come and present about atheistic moral Platonism, but they will somehow try and ground these moral values in some other system out there. Because we know what atheistic moral Platonism is, we know what are the implications of holding on to that view. And we see that when you hold on to atheistic moral Platonism, we are asking questions like, what does it mean? How does it exist? Can it exist if there is no human? Can we ask questions like, is love just? Does that make sense to ask those questions? And we also see that when you have atheistic moral Platonism, you lose out on aspects like moral duty. And you also have the problem of the improbability that exists, that we can make sense of the abstract by being here by pure chance. So knowledge of atheistic moral Platonism, even if no one will ever come and ask you about atheistic moral Platonism, is that you will see people present a defense for, let's call it atheistic morality, by bringing out concepts that are in line with atheistic moral Platonism. So this knowledge is something that we can transfer into our dialogues with them. So to recap, we saw what is the difference between objective and subjective. Object dependent on the object the action. Subject dependent on the subject. Values has to do with the inherent worth of that action, good or bad. Duties has to do with the obligatoriness of that action. Should I do it? Ought I do it or not? Right and wrong. And we saw how values and duties fare under atheism, the difficulty on grounding it. We also saw whether atheists can be moral. Because we're not talking about belief in God, we're talking God. You need to have God for objective morality to exist, even if no one believes that God exists. And we also saw how atheistic moral Platonism fails to account for objective moral values and duties. So that is the conclusion of this part of the moral argument. In the subsequent part, we will probe into premise 1. We'll probe more into premise 2. How can we say that objective moral values exist? Right? You will come across certain questions like my cousin asked long back before I got into apologetics. If a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, did it actually make a noise? And you go like, wait, what? And then he asked a question like, you see blue and I see blue. Are we seeing the same shades of blue? So all of this has to do with our perception of the physical world. How can we say that we all perceive the moral world in the same way? Can't we have differences? How do you defend it? And so on and so forth. So the next part, we will look at how we can present that morality is objective, how we can make a case for it, and then how all of that would connect towards God and how we can apply it in practically. So that is the conclusion. I think we can stop the streaming before we take time for Q&A.